You see a big fat red mark on your flasher at 30 feet. You drop your best lure down, park it right on his nose, and he ignores you. You try a different color. Nothing. You switch baits. Still nothing. What if I told you the problem isn't your lure? It's that the fish isn't even there. Today we're talking about the single biggest misunderstanding in ice fishing electronics. The difference between the depth your flasher shows you and the depth where the fish actually is. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why you've been fishing above or below the fish you're targeting and how a simple mental adjustment will get you more bites. This is the reason why that finicky fish just won't commit. It's because he can't even see your bait. Be honest, have you ever blamed the fish for being negative when your screen was lit up like a Christmas tree? Let me know down in the comments. For decades, we've been taught to trust our electronics implicitly. The old wisdom was simple. If you see a mark at 20 feet on your Vexilar, you drop your lure to 20 feet. It's a one-to-one relationship. It makes sense, it's easy to remember, and for the most part, it's what everyone does. This belief gets passed down from one generation of ice anglers to the next. The problem is, this simple way of thinking is the source of endless frustration on the ice. It's the reason you spend hours jigging over a mark that never moves, never bites, and eventually just fades away. We end up blaming a cold front, the barometric pressure, or just plain bad luck. We convince ourselves the fish are in a negative mood. But the truth is, we're often just fishing in the wrong place, thanks to a simple misinterpretation of what our electronics are actually telling us. It's time to move beyond the old deeper is deeper mindset and start understanding the geometry of what's happening beneath the ice. So let's start with the absolute foundation of this entire concept. This is the one thing you need to tattoo on the inside of your brain before we go any further. Your flasher, regardless of the brand, does not measure vertical depth. I'm going to say that one more time because it is critical. Your flasher does not measure straight down. What it actually measures is distance. The best way to think about it is like a laser rangefinder you'd use for deer hunting. You point it at a target, and it tells you the exact line of sight distance to that target. It doesn't tell you the vertical drop. Your transducer is doing the exact same thing, but with sound. It sends out a ping. That sound travels through the water, hits an object, the bottom, a weed, a fish, and bounces back. The machine measures the time that round trip took and converts it into a distance measurement. So when you see that mark at 28 feet, it means the fish is 28 feet away from the transducer face, not necessarily 28 feet straight down. Now, to understand why that distance measurement isn't the same as vertical depth, we need to talk about the sonar cone. Every ice fisherman has heard this term, but many don't truly grasp what it means for their fishing. Imagine an ice cream cone. The pointy end is your transducer sitting in the hole. The wide circular part is on the bottom of the lake. This cone is the beam of sound your flasher is sending down into the water. Your flasher can see anything that enters this cone. The angle of that cone is determined by your transducer. Most standard transducers that come with flashers are somewhere between 19 and 20 degrees. Some offer narrower cones, like 8 or 9 degrees, which we'll talk about later. For now, just keep that image in your head. A cone of sound, getting wider and wider the deeper the water gets. Anything inside that cone will send back an echo and show up as a mark on your dial. This is where the confusion begins, because a fish can be anywhere inside that cone. Let's think about that cone for a minute. If a fish swims directly into the dead center of the cone, right underneath your hole, what happens? In this one specific scenario, the old wisdom holds true. The line of sight distance that your flasher measures is the same as the true vertical depth. Think about it. The distance from your transducer straight down to the fish is a vertical line. There's no angle, no horizontal distance to worry about. So if you're lucky enough to have a big walleye park itself directly in the middle of your sonar beam, and your flasher says it's at 22 feet, then you can be confident that it is, in fact, at 22 feet straight down. This is the ideal situation. It's what we all assume is happening every time we see a mark. But as you know from long days on the ice, the ideal situation is rarely what's actually happening down there. The fish are rarely that cooperative. But what happens far more often is that a fish enters the cone from the side. It's not in the center, it's on the outer edge of that ice cream cone of sound. It's still inside the beam, so your flasher picks it up and paints a mark on the screen. Let's say it marks the fish at 30 feet. Now, your brain immediately thinks, okay, drop the lure to 30 feet. But hold on. The fish isn't directly below you anymore. It's off to the side, maybe a few feet to your left or right. The flasher is still measuring the line of sight distance, a diagonal line from your transducer to that fish on the edge of the cone. And as anyone who remembers basic middle school geometry knows, a diagonal line is always longer than a straight vertical line. This is the entire key. The flasher is reading the longer diagonal distance, not the shorter true vertical depth. Okay, I know nobody wants to do math while they're trying to relax and fish, but we have to touch on it for a second. I promise to make it painless. Remember the Pythagorean theorem from school? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's used to figure out the sides of a right-angled triangle. Well, that's exactly what we have happening under the ice. Let's visualize it. Side B is the straight vertical line from your transducer down to the depth the fish is at. This is the fish's true vertical depth, the number we actually want to know. Side A is the horizontal line, stretching from the center of your hole out to where the fish is swimming on the edge of the cone. And side C, the long diagonal side of the triangle, is the hypotenuse. That side C is the number your flasher is showing you on the screen. It's the direct line distance from the transducer to the fish. So let's look at that triangle again. You have the true vertical depth, the horizontal distance, and the diagonal distance that your flasher reads. Which side of a right-angled triangle is always the longest? It's always C, the hypotenuse, always. This means the number displayed on your flasher is always either equal to the true depth if the fish is in the center, or greater than the true depth if the fish is anywhere else in the cone. Let me repeat that. The depth you see on your flasher is the absolute deepest that fish could possibly be. In almost every single case, the fish is actually swimming at a depth that is shallower than what your screen is telling you. The moment you truly understand this, the way you interpret your electronics will change forever. You'll stop blindly trusting the number and start thinking about where the fish really is. Now you're probably asking, okay, I get it, but how much of a difference are we really talking about? Is it a few inches or a few feet? And that's a great question. The answer is, it depends on the depth and the position of the fish in the cone. The difference can be negligible in some cases and absolutely massive in others. Let's use some real-world numbers to paint a clear picture. Let's say you're fishing in a common scenario, 30 feet of water, and you're using a standard transducer with a 20-degree cone angle. This is a setup that thousands of anglers are using on the ice right at this very moment. We're going to break down exactly how far off your flasher reading can be in this typical situation, both for fish on the bottom and for those highly sought-after suspended fish that can be so tricky to catch. First, we need to know how big our sonar cone is at that depth. There are online calculators for this, but a good rule of thumb for a 20-degree cone is that the diameter of the cone is roughly 1/3 of the depth. So, in 30 feet of water, your cone on the bottom is going to have a diameter of about 10 feet. Let that sink in. You're looking at a 10-foot wide circle on the bottom of the lake. That's a huge area. A fish could be anywhere in that 10-foot circle and still show up on your screen. When you drop your lure down the hole, you're only covering a few square inches in the absolute center of that massive circle. You're essentially a tiny needle in a very large haystack. This is why fish can appear on your screen but seem to completely ignore a lure that you think is right in their face. Let's stick with our example. We're in 30 feet of water with that 10-foot wide cone on the bottom. Now, a fish comes in and sits right on the bottom at the very edge of your cone. Horizontally, it's about 5 feet away from being directly under your hole. Your flasher picks it up and paints a beautiful bright mark right at 30 feet. So, you drop your lure down to 30 feet. But is the fish really at 30 feet? No. The flasher is reading C, the diagonal distance. The horizontal distance, A, is 5 feet. So using our math, we can find the true vertical depth, B. And in this case, the true vertical depth of that fish is approximately 29.5 feet. That's a 6-inch difference. You've dropped your lure 6 inches below the fish. For a bottom-hugging walleye or a perch, 6 inches might as well be a mile. They're looking straight ahead, and your bait is buried in the mud beneath them. You might think, 6 inches? That's not a huge deal. And sometimes it isn't. But it's a matter of percentages and playing the odds. More importantly, this effect becomes much more pronounced and much more critical when you're targeting suspended fish. Think about crappies or cruising walleyes that are holding 10 or 15 feet off the bottom. These are often the most active, most aggressive fish in the system, but they're also the ones most affected by this sonar cone geometry problem. Let's imagine we are in that same 30 feet of water, but now we see a mark suspended at 15 feet. Your flasher is screaming at you, "Fish at 15 feet!" So what's happening in reality? Let's break down the numbers for this exact scenario, because this is where most anglers make the biggest mistake and miss out on the most fish. At a depth of 15 feet, halfway to the bottom, our 20-degree cone is not 10 feet wide anymore. It's half that. The diameter is about 5 feet. So, we're looking at a 5-foot circle. Now, a big crappie cruises in and stops at the very edge of that circle. Horizontally, it's about 2.5 feet away from your lure. The flasher shows a mark right at 15 feet, so you diligently lower your tungsten jig down until your line marker is at the 15-foot mark. You're watching the screen, you see your jig and the fish on the same line, and you wait for the bite. But it never comes. Why? Because the fish isn't at 15 feet. It's actually shallower. You're dangling your lure underneath it, where it probably can't even see it well, especially if it's looking up to feed. Let's do the math for that suspended crappie one last time. The flasher reading, C, is 15 feet. The horizontal distance to the edge of the cone, A, is 2.5 feet. When you calculate the true vertical depth, B, it comes out to 14.8 feet. That's a difference of about 2.5 inches. Now, I know what you're thinking. 2.5 inches is nothing. But with suspended fish that are actively feeding upwards, being even slightly below them can take you completely out of the strike zone. They're keyed in on what's above them. By trusting your flasher blindly, you have positioned your bait in the least effective spot possible. You should have stopped your lure a half foot above the mark on your screen to draw that fish up. This small adjustment is the difference between a blank screen and a bucket of slabs. Now let's talk about the scenario where this entire concept goes from being a small detail to being a massive, day-ruining problem. That scenario is fishing on a steep slope or a sharp drop-off. This is where your flasher will lie to you in the most blatant and confusing way possible. Every seasoned angler has experienced this. You drill a hole, you drop your transducer, and you see a confusing mess on the screen. You see what looks like a thick band of fish, or a bottom that seems to be 10 feet deeper than it should be. You're fishing over what you think is a school of fish, but you get 0 bites. That's because you're not marking fish at all. You're marking the phantom bottom, a ghost created by the geometry of your sonar cone hitting the slope at an angle. Picture this. You're on a sharp break line, looking for walleyes. You drill your hole, and the water directly beneath you is 20 feet deep, but just a few feet away from your hole, the bottom drops away steeply to 30 feet. Your transducer sends out its cone of sound. The part of the cone that goes straight down hits the bottom at 20 feet, and you get a solid bottom reading there. But the outer edge of your cone, the part that's angled outwards, travels further before it hits the slope. It might hit the bottom where the depth is actually 28 feet. So, what does your flasher show you? It shows you both readings. It will show a solid bottom at 20 feet, and then it will show a second, often weaker mark at 28 feet. It looks exactly like a big fish suspended 8 feet off the bottom. This is the ultimate trap. Your screen is telling you there's a big suspended mark at 28 feet over a 20-foot bottom. It looks like the easiest target in the world. So you spend the next hour dropping every lure in your box down to 28 feet, trying to catch a fish that doesn't exist. You're literally jigging in empty water, well below the actual bottom that's right under your feet. The flasher isn't broken. It's just telling you the truth. It's telling you it sees something at a distance of 20 feet, the bottom below you, and it sees something else at a distance of 28 feet, the slope further away. Learning to recognize this phantom bottom signal is a high-level skill that separates the pros from the rest. The key is knowing that on a slope, your cone is giving you a wide, distorted picture of the underwater landscape. So, how can you use this information to become a better angler? How do you fight back against this built-in lie from your electronics? It all comes down to interpreting the quality of the mark, not just its depth. The strength of the return signal tells you a lot about the fish's location within the cone. A fish that is directly in the center of the cone is getting hit with the most powerful part of the sonar pulse. It's going to return a very strong, very clear signal. On your flasher, this will show up as a thick, bright red line. It will be consistent and won't flicker much. When you see a mark like that, you can be much more confident that the flasher's depth reading is accurate, or at least very close to accurate. This is your high percentage target. On the other hand, a fish on the outer edge of the cone is only getting grazed by the weakest part of the sonar pulse. The return signal will be much weaker. On your flasher, this will look very different. Instead of a thick red line, you might see a thinner, weaker line, maybe orange or even green. It might flicker on and off the screen as the fish moves slightly in and out of the cone's fringe. When you see a mark like this, a little alarm bell should go off in your head. This is the signal that the fish is on the edge of the cone, and therefore it is absolutely 100% shallower than what the flasher is telling you. This is the mark you need to fish a foot or two above to have any chance of catching it. This is also why having a narrow cone angle option on your transducer is such a powerful tool. Many modern electronics, like the Humminbird Ice Helix or high-end Vexilars and Marcums, have what's called dual spectrum or dual beam transducers. You can switch from a wide 20-degree cone to a much narrower beam, sometimes as tight as 8 or 9 degrees. When you switch to that narrow cone, you are drastically reducing the size of that circle on the bottom. You are focusing your sonar energy into a much smaller footprint. This gives you a much more precise, much more accurate picture of what is directly below your hole. It helps eliminate those ghost marks from the edge of the cone and gives you more confidence in the depth readings you're seeing. It's like switching from a shotgun to a rifle. Let's put that into practice. You're in wide cone mode and you see a faint flickering mark at 25 feet. You suspect it's a fish on the edge of your cone. So, you switch to your narrow cone mode. If the mark disappears completely, you know for sure it was a fish off to the side, and it's not directly under you. You can either move to try and get on top of it or just ignore it. But if you switch to narrow cone mode, and that mark gets stronger and turns into a solid red line, you've just confirmed that the fish is sitting directly below you. Now you can trust that 25-foot depth reading. Using both cone angles together allows you to first find fish with the wide beam, and then pinpoint their exact location and true depth with the narrow beam. It's an advanced tactic that will absolutely put more fish on the ice for you. So, the grand takeaway from all of this is a simple but powerful rule. Always start by fishing above the mark. If you see a signal on your screen, assume the fish is shallower than the reading. Bring your lure down to a foot or two above where the flasher says the fish is and hold it there. Your goal is to make that fish commit and rise up to your bait. This is a much more aggressive and predatory response than trying to drop a lure right on its head, which can often spook them. Watch the mark on the flasher. If it starts to rise up to meet your lure's signal, that's the moment of truth. You've intercepted the fish at its true depth and triggered its feeding instinct. This single change in your approach, from dropping on top of them to drawing them up from below, will fundamentally change your success rate, especially for suspended species like crappie and for neutral mood walleyes. So, let's put it all together. Your flasher is a range finder, not a depth finder. It tells you the distance to an object, not how far down it is. The fish you're marking is almost always shallower than the number on the screen. The game-changing moment is realizing that you should always fish slightly above the mark, especially if it's a faint or inconsistent one. For years, you might have been dropping your lure right past them, wondering why they wouldn't bite. This changes everything. It means you can stop wasting time on unbiteable fish that were never really there. You'll have more confidence in your gear because you'll understand what it's truly telling you. You'll position your lure where it can actually be seen, triggering more strikes from those fish you previously thought were just ignoring you. Thanks for watching. If this just blew your mind, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next tip that breaks down another old fishing myth. Now I want to hear from you. After hearing this, are you going to change how you approach a mark on your flasher? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.